Today's tutorial is a bit of an epic. I'm going to answer a question I get asked on the channel all the time. How do you work out the chords to a song? Now the answer isn't super difficult, but it does involve digging pretty deep into how music actually works. So I'm going to take you through a 5-step process that, if you put in a little bit of time and effort, should help you to work out the chords for most songs more easily than if you just did it by, trial and error or by ear. Now, as usual when I make a tutorial like this, I'm going to assume that you know some basic music theory, like what a key is and, the identities of some simple chords like C major and D minor. If you don't know that stuff, then head to my channel page and check out some of my more basic tutorials on chords. I'll stick a couple of example links in the description underneath this video. As I go along, I'm going to be making a few shortcuts and generalizations to make the music theory side of this more accessible, because I think it's important to kind of grasp the big ideas first, and you can figure out all the details and the exceptions and so on once you've mastered the basic skill. Anyway, let's assume that we've heard this song and picked out the melody on the piano. If you don't know it, that's an Old English nursery rhyme called This Old Man. And it's a good tune to look at here because it's straightforward. But it's not so simple that the harmony is really obvious. Let's hear it again. Okay, so let's go through our 5 steps for figuring out the chords. Step 1 is to work out the song's key. Now the easiest way of doing that is to look at the note that the melody finishes on, because that note will almost always be the tonic, which is the note that the key is named after. So let's just look at the end of our melody. Okay, so our final note is C, and that narrows us down to 2 keys, C major or C minor. Very quickly we can work out that actually we're in C major, and we can do that just by listening to the overall sound of the melody. It has that kind of bright, positive, open sound that we associate with the major keys rather than the kind of darker sound of a minor key. Also, if you know a little bit of music theory, you might have figured out the key as you were working out the melody, because you'll have seen that it uses exclusively the notes of the C major scale. Okay, not the notes of the C minor scale, but C major. Some melodies use notes outside the scale of the key, but this one is just sticking to C major, so we've got a really strong indication of the key. That's handy because now that we know the song is in C major, that immediately tells us several things. It tells us that there's a very strong probability that the first chord we're looking for will be C major. Let's try it under the start of the melody. Okay, that works pretty well, so we've found our first chord. That's not always 100% reliable because sometimes songs do start on chords that aren't the tonic chord, that aren't the chord that the key is named after, and on notes that aren't from that tonic chord. But it's always a pretty reliable guess to start with, okay? Try the tonic chord under the start of the melody. It also tells us that we're actually looking for, in all probability, chords that come from a relatively limited list. In other words, the chords that we would call the diatonic chords of C major, the chords built on the C major scale. Those are C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, and also B diminished, although that diminished chord is actually pretty rare. Now many songs will use non-diatonic chords, chords that aren't taken from the scale of their key, but we'll talk about them in step 5 later. The chances are that most of the chords we're looking for come from this list: C, D minor, E minor, F, G and A minor. Some of them might be extensions of those chords like G7 or F major 7, but those are the basic chords we're looking for. As I said, that diminished chord is pretty unlikely to turn up. Step 2 is to figure out which notes in the melody are chord notes. Very broadly, you can divide the notes in any melody into 3 types: chord notes, which belong to the underlying chords in the progression; passing notes, which are like stepping stones between chord notes, and then anticipations and suspensions. I'm going to put those to one side for now and deal with them in step 5. Let's just think about chord notes and passing notes. If we can look at a melody and guess which are likely to be the chord notes and which are likely to be the passing notes, we can get very close to figuring out the underlying chord progression very quickly. So let's look again at the opening of This Old Man. Okay, now we've worked out that our E and G motif to start with probably has a C chord underneath. Okay, so let's look at this next phrase. Okay, it's a little run down the scale, A, G, F, E, and then a run up again, D, E, F. We have to work out which notes in that little fragment are most likely to be chord notes. Now we can get a big clue about whether a note is a chord note or a passing note just from where it sits relative to the song's beat. Now you could think of This Old Man as having either 2 beats or 4 beats in the bar. It's easiest for us if we count it in 4s, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In a 4-beat bar, the stronger beats are beats 1 and 3, what we call the on beats, while beats 2 and 4, the off beats, are weaker. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That holds good for nearly all types of music, apart from things like jazz and swing, where it's the other way round. But that, that's a discussion for another day. Now, here's the important thing. You're more likely to find chord notes on beats, and you're more likely to find passing notes on off beats. So chord notes are more likely to be stressed on the on beats, and passing notes more likely to be unstressed on the off beats. That's a vast oversimplification because clearly any one beat can be divided into several notes, and some of them will be chord notes and some of them passing notes. But just try and grasp that high level concept for now. Chord notes on beat, stressed; passing notes unstressed, off beat. So in that descending section, 1, 2, 3, 4, the notes we've got on the off beat and on the on beat, are A and F. 1, 2, 3, 4. So they are probably the chord notes, while G and E are probably passing notes, stepping stones that are just part of the journey to somewhere else. Now, think back to that list of diatonic chords of C. If we think about A and F, they suggest we need either the chord of F major or the chord of D minor. Let's try both of those. There it is with F, those 4 notes, and there with D minor. Okay? Now hold that thought for a second while we look at the little ascending section that comes after it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Our on-beat notes there are D and F. And that kind of suggests a chord of D minor. But, and it's a big but, we're now at a point of tension in the melody because we're about to go back to a phrase that sounds a little bit like the very first phrase or maybe is on the same chord, and that kind of suggests that we need what's called a dominant chord, something we'll think about in more detail in step 3. For now though, the chord I'm going to drop in there is G7. That's an extension of the basic chord of G, which appears in C major, and it includes the notes D and F, and it's a really good strong dominant chord. It wants to take us back to the tonic chord, which is C. Okay, so for that whole phrase we could either go F to G7, bear in mind I'm playing these chords in different inversions down here, that's still a G7 chord, F, G7, or we could go D minor to G7, and both sound kind of okay, so we could just choose one and settle for that. What I'm going to do though is make the progression more interesting and use both like this. Okay, F, D minor, G7. Okay, so I'm switching my F and D minor halfway down that little run. I can do that because there are no really kind of definite accepted canonical chords for this song. If you're working out the chords from a more modern song, that's when you need to use your ear and say, oh, okay, is it really that chord or that chord? Does it sound like a major or a minor chord underneath? What does my favourite band do at that particular point? But for here, we have a bit more liberty to go our own way when we have a choice. So the number one way to spot those chord notes is to look at what's going on on the stressed beats of each bar. If we do that, it's fairly easy to start getting a good idea of what chords might be where, and give us a picture of the whole progression. Step 3. Now, in steps 1 and 2, we've already put together a pretty good method for figuring out the basic chords that are likely to underlie our method. But we can kind of confirm things or get a clearer sense if we understand a little bit about how chord progressions tend to work. To do that, let's go back to the diatonic chords of our key, C major. C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished. Now, all of those chords have got their individual names, but as you might know, we can also give them numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. Doing that is handy because it means it's easier to discuss chords across keys. So, for example, if we were in the key of E flat major, the diatonic chords of E flat major are different chords with different names. E flat, F minor, G minor, A flat, B flat, C minor, D diminished. But we can number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So, if we're comparing and discussing, it's much easier to work across the two keys. And the important thing here is that both of those major keys, like all major keys, have the same pattern of major and minor chords, okay, just in a different key. So in C, major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, and in E flat, major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. Now, most progressions in any major key, and any minor key as well, tend to start and to finish on the number 1 chord, which we also call the tonic chord. It's the chord that has the same name as the key, C major in this case, yeah? The second most important chord is the number 5 chord, the so-called dominant. It's important because the dominant chord, the number 5 chord, resolves strongly to the tonic. In other words, in the key of C, whenever we hit a G chord, it wants to drag us back to C, to the tonic. Okay, you can hear that. 5, 1. The dominant 7th chord, G7 in the key of C, it's just a G chord with an F added, is even stronger. Now, number 5 chords, dominants, tend to appear at the points of maximum tension in a melody. Yeah, the point of the kind of greatest journey out, if you like. And usually, but not always, right before the progression comes back to the tonic. Now, we saw that in This Old Man, where we get this G7 chord right before we head back to the C chord, the tonic. Okay, and that G7 there has just got that E passing note in there, but we can work out it's the G7 because of its position right before we return to the tonic, and because it's got these two giveaway notes, the D and the F. That kind of journey from 1 to 5 and back again is very, very common, okay? It's a real central underpinning of most chord progressions, and you can assume that it or something like it is happening in pretty much every chord progression to every song you deal with. So that means you can use those 1 and 5 chords as, if you like, the temp poles to hang your progression on. It starts on the 1 chord and it's going to go to a 5. What you need to do is fill in the chords between the two. Now watch out, because sometimes a songwriter will use a less strong chord in the dominant position, often a number 4 chord, that's F in the key of C, or he or she will use a chord substitution. In other words, they'll stick in a more complex chord that functions like a dominant. And a classic one is D minor 7 over G. Okay, you can hear that resolve, and that's relatively less common, but do keep an ear out for it. It's something you will learn to spot with experience. And if, when you've got one of those complex chords, complex substitutions, if you just put in the regular dominant instead, it should still work. As you're deciding what goes between your two temp poles of 1 and 5, if you like, it's worth bearing in mind there's also lots of very common combinations of chords. A very common one is 2, 5, 1. Okay, D minor, G, and C in the key of C. And as you can see, we had that crop up in This Old Man. D minor, G7, okay, back to C, 2, 5, 1. And, you know, there are quite a few rules about which chords work well in a progression with one another, like that. Now, rather than trying to learn over all those patterns and rules and so on, the thing to do here is to look at the chord progressions of songs you can already play, yeah? If you expand the number of songs that you know how to play, you kind of absorb a feeling for which chords feel, kind of fall naturally into which positions in a progression. In other words, the more you work on becoming a better musician, the easier this kind of understanding of how chord progressions work will become. So let's put steps 1 to 3 into action and try harmonising the rest of this old man. I'll go from the start and shout the chords out as I go. C, F, D minor, G7, C, G7, C, G, C. Okay? Step 4 is to use your ear to check that you're happy with the chords that you've worked out. Now that might seem obvious, but you know, when you've decided that a particular chord might work in a particular place, play the thing and ask yourself, does this sound right? And if there are any alternatives, and often there will be, play those as well. Now if you're working out the chords for a contemporary song for which you have recordings, this is really just a case of saying, is this what those guys are playing here, or is it something different? But if you're writing your own material or you're arranging a traditional song or such like, as we're doing here, this is the point at which, if you like, a little artistic judgment needs to come in, and you need to make a decision based on what you think sounds good. So when I was harmonising this old man initially in step 2, I could have settled for something simpler. I could have gone C, F, G7. In other words, missed out that D minor chord that I dropped in for a little bit of extra colour, and it would have sounded fine. I could have also made it just a little bit richer. You remember right at the start I was trying to decide whether I should be using a C or an E minor chord to cover the E and the G right at the start. Well, as long as I start with the tonic chord, the C, there's no reason why I can't drop the E minor in for a little bit of extra colour. Listen to this. So instead of just hanging around on the tonic chord, instead I've changed chord. I've gone to the number 3 chord to E minor. And in consequence, the whole thing is a little bit richer. Step 5 is to check for complications and exceptions. Now there are several of these that you'll come across, and some are more common than others. The most common and obvious is that the actual chords of the progression will be more developed and extended than the basic underlying chords. Now we've already seen that in this old man, where our basic underlying G chord was extended to a G7. G7. But you'll get all kinds of others, major sevenths and minor sevenths and augmented and diminished, and that crop up from time to time. Now the way to deal with this added complexity is to be really familiar with your piano chords and to know their sounds when you hear them. And the way to do that is to play lots of other people's songs, really familiarise yourself with how songs tend to work, just like we said in the previous step. That way you can say to yourself, the notes here tend to suggest there's an A minor chord, but the overall sound hints at A minor 7. Yeah, so if you're not entirely comfortable with your chords already, do learn them. Check out my epic chords tutorial. I'll put a link underneath this video, and play lots of other people's songs. Another thing you can try to do is to put chord extensions into your own harmonisation. So if you're harmonising a traditional tune or writing your own song, play around with extended chords to learn their sounds. If we go back to this old man, there are several places where we could have used quite richly extended chords. So that was exactly the same tune, but instead of using basic chords, I was using C major 7, E minor 7, then F major 7, then D minor 7 to G7. And again, that just comes down to knowing your chords and experimenting with where they might fit. Something else you'll come across is the occasional non-diatonic chord. That's when a chord progression remains in the key of, for example, C, but goes beyond the chords of that key and briefly uses, for example, an E flat chord before returning to the diatonic chords of the key. Now, non-diatonics are usually reasonably easy to spot because they have this kind of striking, unexpected sound before they resolve back to where you expect them to go. And sometimes you can work them out from the melody because, like an E flat crops up out of nowhere. But a lot of the times it's one of those situations where you just have to use your ears and your experience. Another fairly common difficulty is when a melody starts with a chord other than the tonic, yeah? Now, if you're pretty sure that a song is in a particular key but the tonic chord doesn't fit under the opening of the melody, that's the situation you could be looking at. A slightly related complication is when a song starts minor and then goes major for the chorus, or is mostly major but has a minor key bridge passage. That can throw you at first, but it's worth remembering that if that happens, you're usually going to be going from the major key to its relative minor. In other words, the minor key that shares the same notes and chords as the major key. So that would be A minor for the key of C major. Just watch out for the fact that in the minor, the number 5 chord is sometimes major to give it a stronger resolution. So if you're in A minor, if you think a song is in A minor, then the natural 5th chord of A minor is E minor, but often it's made major to give a stronger resolution back to that A minor. Again, all stuff that you learn by experience and by playing and studying a lot of other people's songs. Finally, as sort of an add-on to step 5, be aware that you can sometimes be led astray by anticipations and suspensions in a melody. I'm not going to dig too deeply into these because there's something that you'll learn to spot as you grow in experience, but basically they are important notes, stressed notes, that don't seem to belong to the chord that's underneath them. And usually they're either a hangover from the chord before, okay, which is a suspension, or they're part of a chord that is about to arrive, which is an anticipation. As I say, anticipations and suspensions are things that you will learn to spot, especially if you play lots of other people's songs. A really famous example of this, just to give you one, of this kind of non-chord note, right at the start of a melody actually, is from the Queen and David Bowie song Under Pressure, which you might know. It's in the key of D major. The verse starts like this. A beautiful chord progression all over that sort of D pedal tone. We've got D, A and G, but each of those chords starts with a note that's kind of been suspended from somewhere else. So that very first note is a G resolving down to the F sharp, and then the next chord is A, but we hang over, we suspend the F sharp from the D down to the A, and then we suspend the E from the A down onto the G. It's a lovely tune, lovely chord progression. Okay, and just shows you some of the really beautiful effects actually that you can create. Freddie Mercury, great master of chord progressions and creating these lovely sounds, by using that kind of just slight added complexity. But do be aware of those. Again, you don't come across anticipations and suspensions too often, but as I say, the thing is simply to be aware that these potential problems exist, and if you're struggling to work out the chords to a melody using the method that I've described, do consider that something like that is at work. Okay, so there we go. As I said at the start, pretty epic kind of tutorial there, but hopefully it's given you some really useful insights. As usual, just a couple of quick plugs to finish with. My book, How to Really Play the Piano, the stuff your teacher never taught you. If you're unsure about things like chords and you want to get started with improvisation and things like that, this is the book for you. Basic harmony, basic chords, all explained, as well as roots into stuff like, as I say, improvising jazz, blues, pop, whatever. Click the link underneath the video or in the top right hand corner. Also, just a really quick plug for my new book, 7 Studies in Pop Piano. This is for those of you guys who are interested in pop piano, that's kind of Ben Folds, Elton John, that kind of style, and who also can read music. It's 7 short pieces of music, each one with a bunch of notes explaining the harmony and the theory and the particular tricks and techniques used in pop piano. So again, there's a link underneath the video, do check that out. There we go. Next video that will be coming out will be in a week or two's time. It will be the next in my Train Your Piano Brain series. Okay, look forward to seeing you there. Bye bye.